Hello, class. This is Andre Godsey, one of your classmates. This week, week 2, I'm leading you in the presentation for the week that Dr. Wynn assigned for us, and I start off on week 2. Again, Andre Godsey is my name, and Psychology 512. The table of contents for this presentation consists of the opening summary of both the Kaysen, Caddy, and journal articles. The specific examination of 4 and 5 of the major points and topics for the week, and my 2 questions for you with a summary and a conclusion statement at the end. We start off with a summary of the Kaysen chapter 3 and 4, and the first concept is called the self-concept, as discussed by Kaysen and others, is defined as the sum total of beliefs that people have about themselves. The elements that emerge or explain what the term self-concept means are rudiments of the self-concept, what fundamentally consists of the self-concept, the introspection. After one has a self-concept, then how do they continue to live that introspection? The influences of other people, the autobiographical memories, culture, and the self-concept. So then the second part of the chapter 3 of Kaysen and others has to do with self-esteem. Self-esteem is defined as our positive or negative views of ourselves, our self-evaluations. In terms related to self-esteem are the need for self-esteem. We ask a question in that chapter. A question is asked, are there gender or race differences? That is, do females and males feel the same way about themselves in terms of self-esteem? And are there race differences? Self-discrepancy theory is discussed in this chapter. The self-awareness trap, the self-regulation and its limits, ironic mental processes, mechanisms of self-enhancement, and are positive illusions adaptive? How does culture and self-esteem go hand in hand? Do they have an influence over one or another? And they do. They discuss culture is important on the self-esteem of the individual and how we relate to others. Thirdly, Kaysen and others talk about self-presentation. Self-presentation is defined as strategies people use to shape what others think of them. The elements related to self-presentation are strategic self-presentation, self-verification, and self-monitoring. Reflections in the end of chapter 3 deal with this multifaceted self, seeking to find the authentic self. I'm reminded of another psychological concept coming out of Abraham Maslow, who talked about self-actualization, how very few people find out why they are really here, what their true purpose is, as the Latin phrase, the summum bonum, or in the French, it would be one's raison d'etre, your purpose for being. This is what Kaysen and others it's related to the multifaceted self, seeking the authentic self. We move on then to chapter 4. Kaysen and others talk about observation, the elements of social perception, how others view us, how we view others in that observation. And the elements here are included a person's physical appearance, how we look, perceptions of situations, how the individual perceives the situation to be, behavioral evidence, and then detecting truth and deception. Secondly, attribution. This term will become more vital and more explained as we go along. From the elements to dispositions includes attribution theories, attribution biases, culture and attribution and motivational biases. From attribution, we move to integration, from dispositions and impressions, information integration, the arithmetic, deviations from the arithmetic, and perceptions of moral character. Information biases from impressions to reality, perseverance of beliefs, confirmatory hypothesis testing, and the self-fulfilling prophecy. And then finally, in chapter 4 of Kessin and Others, we find social perception. That's the bottom line. How do others perceive us? How we perceive others. We move on to Caddy and Others, and we talk about the attribution theories, how theories make sense of behavior. This is coming out of Mall's chapter, in chapter 3, talking about Heidegger's theory of attribution. He summarizes that, and Jones and Davis's abandoned theory are explained, or the explanation of that. Kelly's theory of attribution as causal judgment, other attribution research, and finally the folk conceptual theory of behavior explanation. Social comparison, motives, standards, and mechanisms. Festinger's social comparison theory is discussed. Why do people engage in social comparison? Why do we consider comparing ourselves with other cultures, other mores and folkways, how other people do various things? And that's discussed in the chapter. Then 2 other questions. To whom do people compare themselves, and how do social comparisons influence the self? Finally, applications of social comparison theory is also discussed in chapter 5 of Cowdee's reading. We move on to the journal article from Lennox and Others. Consumers' responses to negative word-of-mouth communication, an attribution theory perspective. So this study examines the word-of-mouth communication, or WOMC, and has 3 components. Those 3 components are: messages include information about the consensus view of the brand, number 1. Number 2, consistency of the communications experiences with the brand over time. And then number 3, the distinctiveness of the communicator's opinion over the focal brand versus other brands in the category. So then in this article, the researchers examined the attributable process between negative WOMC and post-exposure brand evaluations. Cognitive mechanisms explain the negative word-of-mouth communication brand evaluation linkage. So then the journal article study is consistent with other studies related to causal attributional reasoning. So then the theory emerges in this journal, and it has to do with negative word-of-mouth communication. It is defined as interpersonal communication about a product or marketing organization, the object of the communication. Negative word-of-mouth communication potentially has more consumer behavior than print sources because of accessibility. The central theme of attributional theory is that causal analysis is inherent in individuals and the need to understand social events. Why individuals give another brand negative views. And my understanding of that is the individual that is explaining a product, let's say something didn't work, and you're sharing that over a cup of coffee, and someone seeking to buy something or get something or to test drive a car, and you say, no, that car doesn't work. And because they have respect for you, they end up ultimately not buying it, thus being negative word-of-mouth communication. That leads then to hypothesis 1, which is causal attributions will mediate the effects of negative word-of-mouth communications on brand evaluations. And then the second part of the that area of the article has to do with information type and causal attributions. Classic attribution theory states that their responses to information include stimulus, the brand, as I said before, the communicator, who that person may be, the circumstance, where you may be located, or a combination of the three. The transmission of the how information is exposed, and that is key as well. Negative word-of-mouth communication. The consensus refers to how the audience concurs with the communicator. And then the second hypothesis has to do with consumers exposed to negative word-of-mouth communication configured as high consensus. The Valkenburg, or the second journal article and others, had to do with friend networking sites and their relationship to adolescents' well-being and social self-esteem. Part 1, friend networking and its consequences. Young people in the Netherlands, they communicated with each other, and 3 things were important: the physical appearance, the romantic attractiveness, and the forming and maintaining close relationships. And again, the study was located in the Dutch area of Amsterdam or in the Netherlands. It examined well-being and self-esteem. So then the internet is used for communication rather than information. It influences social self-esteem and well-being. Very important. And this is a new concept that shows up in the Valkenburg article, that rather than getting information on the internet, these sites, if you will, were used to communicate. And that communication dealt with the social self-esteem and well-being of those Dutch young people that were on those websites. Finally, the feedback on the self and peer involvement are likely to occur when communicating online. The Valkenburg article and others goes on to talk about the how usage of the internet, and I think I already mentioned that. The historical use of the internet was for either self-esteem or well-being, but when both self-esteem and well-being were studied together, the article said that something new happened, and it triggered the opportunity for young people's self-esteem to go higher when they had more people responding to their particular website, or when they formulated more friendships based on the romantic and the deeply involved encounter in that relationship. So then, the hypothesis of the study, Valkenburg, they talk about more theorists believe self-esteem is the cause and well-being, and that is ultimately the effect. Ordinarily, well-being, or rather self-esteem, is the cause, and well-being is the effect. That's the most noted theory. But our current study posits social self-esteem will predict well-being and will determine the usage of friend networking sites. So from that new idea comes 2 hypotheses. 1, social self-esteem predicts adolescents using friend networking as communication in a positive manner. Number 2, forming relationships on social friend networking sites also had a lot to do with a positive experience of communication on the internet in the Dutch community. Hypothesis 2B, relating friendships or receiving friendships on the social sites, was another key part of the hypothesis of the study. The more positive responses, this is hypothesis 3, the more positive those responses were on the dating sites, the higher the self-esteem. I think I already mentioned that. And the frequency of the reactions creates the chance of making a deeper relationship with the individuals that they were talking to. Thus, the discussion of the Valkenburg journal article was first to show the consequences of Dutch adolescents between 10 and 19 and their social self-esteem and their well-being. Thus, romantic relationships and friendships based on the quality of their relationships were a predictor of future or sustained relationships in time. Now, my questions that I have for you in summary are, they emerge from both the Valkenburg and the first article that dealt with dealing with the internet and how we deal with word of mouth in terms of buying a product. So question 1, class, does negative word of mouth communication ever influence you to buy something you were ready to buy? That's question 1, coming from the word of mouth article. And then number 2, from the Verklerberg article, can one really find a meaningful relationship on a social networking website that might lead to a marriage, or should these websites be considered strictly entertainment? Thank you. I'm Andre Gossi for this week, number 2, your classmate. I look forward to us discussing my question.